Hello ladies and gentlemen, my name is Pixel, and today on the Sapphire Tech YouTube channel we're going to be taking a quick look at Spider-Man Remastered running at 1440p on our Sapphire Nitro RX 6800 XT graphics card alongside the AMD Ryzen 7 5800X CPU. Most of the gameplay that we're going to be taking a look at today has been captured whilst the game is set to its very high graphical preset, and we do have ray tracing enabled and set to high. I also want to point out that we have set ambient occlusion to SSAO rather than the HBAO Plus that the preset has on by default. The reason for this is that I think there may be an issue with the implementation of HBAO Plus, because if we inspect objects that are close to the ground, you will notice that SSAO does a much better job of producing what looks like shadows and planting said objects to the ground, whereas in contrast HBAO Plus leaves most objects looking like they are floating. Now, despite the game offering FSR 2.0, I don't actually have it enabled in this footage for reasons that we'll go into a little later. To be clear though, it's nothing to do with the quality or implementation of FSR, but that will all make sense soon. With all that said though, let's take a look at some gameplay. Straight off the bat, I want to say that Spider-Man Remastered has exceeded my expectations in terms of gameplay, presentation, and even the performance. Personally, I'm not a massive fan of superhero media, and I wasn't really looking forward to this release. However, within seconds of swinging around the open world, I was sold. Not only does the game feel super responsive, but it also manages to make the very act of swinging from building to building feel incredibly natural, and the freedom of movement granted during combat makes every action you take come across as both cinematic and stylish. The game's fluid animations do a lot of the heavy lifting here. The way that you're able to blend from one move to the next looks natural to the point where I didn't even see animations anymore, I just saw movement, and that is impressive. I also played with ray tracing enabled, and I have to admit that the feature does add a lot to the experience. At first I was expecting it to mainly be used for the windows on skyscrapers, but surprisingly, the reflections are used pretty much everywhere, and they look great whilst performing extremely well. Up until now, I've struggled to find a game where ray traced reflections in particular were truly worth their cost, as they can be, and often are, very expensive to implement. I'm looking at you, Watch Dogs Legion. Here, however, I believe that they make a big enough impact on the moment-to-moment visuals and perform well enough to actually justify their cost. Sure, the game would still be great without them, and I don't doubt that I'd even miss them after about half an hour of playing with them disabled, but they are a nice extra detail for those of you that have the hardware to power them.
I prefer a more direct approach.
During moment-to-moment gameplay, I'd say that our performance was mostly sticking between around 75 and 100 frames per second, with around 20 FPS more during the more linear sections. Cutscenes in general are much more variable, but I don't think I ever saw us dropping below that 60 FPS target. Unfortunately, however, and somewhat surprisingly, our performance was dictated by our CPU rather than our GPU a lot more frequently than what I was expecting, meaning that there's a fair amount of headroom still available if we could increase that CPU performance. Now, as mentioned earlier, I'm not actually running FSR 2.0 despite the option being available. This is simply because the vast majority of the time that my FPS would drop below around 70, it was because I was in the open world and I was being CPU limited, meaning that in the areas where I would want FSR 2.0 to boost my frame rates, that wouldn't be possible because our performance was not being limited by our graphics card. It's also worth pointing out that pretty much all resolution reconstruction techniques come with their own small but measurable performance cost, and yes, that includes both FSR 2.0 and DLSS. Since this game is CPU limited, we want to try to avoid putting any more stress on the CPU than absolutely necessary, hence why I have it disabled. That said, if I was to play this game at 4K or on a lesser powered GPU, I would most certainly play with FSR enabled, since it would be much more likely that the GPU would be the limiting factor when it came down to raw performance. I do plan on taking a look at this game on a couple more of our graphics cards in the coming days, so I will most likely go into more detail then, as I have a feeling that FSR is really going to come in handy when it comes to maintaining a rock solid 60 FPS on cards such as the RX 6700. Unfortunately, whilst the game generally does a decent job of maintaining its smoothness while CPU limited, there are most certainly times where the stress on the CPU becomes a little too much and the game starts feeling a little inconsistent and stuttery. So far, this has only really occurred whilst flying through the city at breakneck speeds, but you are going to be doing that quite a lot, so it's not ideal. Personally, I would recommend those of you on a 60Hz monitor to just enable VSync along with dynamic resolution scaling in order to avoid or at least minimize any CPU related stutters. If like me you are rocking a variable refresh rate monitor, then I'd set DRS to target 54 FPS and then I would manually set a frame rate cap through software such as RTSS, since it tends to add less input latency than most other forms of external frame rate limiters. Based on what I've seen so far, Spider-Man is actually very well optimized in terms of its GPU performance, but more than a little heavy on the CPU. Knowing that gamers tend to hold on to their CPUs for quite a while, I am a little concerned that a lot of gamers out there are really going to struggle to get the most out of their high-end graphics cards due to CPU bottlenecks. It's games like this that really make me wish that I was running the 5800X 3D, as it's likely that extra cache would help me keep things nice and smooth under heavy CPU loads, so maybe that's going to be something that I need to look at in future. Overall, Spider-Man's PC port is up there with some of the very best that we've seen from games that were previously console exclusives, and I have to give it to Sony. They seem to be putting a lot of effort into making sure that we get a great day one PC experience. Sure, we may have to wait a while for said games to come over to PC, but hey, when the games are so well made, I find it hard to complain. With all that said, thank you for stopping by and watching this video. If you are new to the channel, please do remember to slap that subscribe button and ring that bell so that you'll be notified of our future uploads, and if you've liked this video then a like would be very much appreciated. If you've got any questions, suggestions or feedback, you can let me know by leaving me a message down in the comment section below. For now though, that is going to be me done for today, so until next time, from myself and everybody here at the Sapphire Tech YouTube channel, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, we'll catch you later. Bye bye.